Jesus.
Doctor?
What are you doing?
The first Last of Us ended by directly undermining the player's sense of moral confidence. You save Ellie, but not from monsters, scavengers, or bandits, but from exhausted, good, idealistic people that were trying to create a cure.
Wait, let me go.
And it was all because it wasn't the infection, but mankind that killed Sarah, so Joel took revenge and doomed mankind to save Ellie. Therefore, the preferred reading of the game's themes are deliberately left inconclusive. Regardless of if you agree or disagree with this action, the game mechanically passes no judgment. You kill the Firefly all the same. This is something unique to video games. Its participatory nature allows it to draw on an invisible space of emotions where the player can feel one way, but the game can go another.
I'm taking this home.
And this friction can be used to communicate complex emotions like guilt and the raw feeling of unconditional love. In other mediums, this can be communicated through sympathy, but not quite experientially.
Please, you don't have to do this.
Last of Us Part 2 follows this design philosophy by constructing the entire game's narrative around themes of hatred and trauma, and in order to touch the player with these feelings, it's not mechanically or narratively designed to be entertaining, but instead submerges the player into a vicious private universe of despair. This game is particularly polarizing, so this essay isn't about discussing if it's good or bad, but instead seeks to examine its design and narrative techniques because, well, at least that'd be something new to talk about. And yes, I'm also writing this because I haven't talked about trauma for about 4 videos, so yay! The first Last of Us is a peculiar title because everything that was effective about the game came from its explicit capacity to faithfully take on the qualities of TV and film. The focus on acting performances, the predictable fates of supporting characters, and the very premise of an old man learning to live again through the eyes of a child are all basically narrative beats that are as old as time. Therefore, a lot of the gratification came from a mixture of recognizing these tropes and having the capacity to perform them faithfully. The player is not merely an audience member, but an actor, where empathy is the substance of the experience.
Hang back.
Check down there.
On a mechanical level, this is delivered through the constant scarcity from carrying such a limited amount of ammo and how long it takes to upgrade or build anything from scavenging, because that desperation is the game invisibly directing where and when you should feel desperate or powerful. And why looking after Ellie is so important, especially at the end when you have every weapon at your disposal to rescue her. And on a narrative level, everything from world building to side characters were all subtly designed to support Joel's rebirth.
Oh, don't make me repeat myself.
What are you doing?
Bill was who Joel was before he looked after Ellie, Henry is who Joel would become, and Tommy was the transition point. Like the image of nature reclaiming the urban landscape, everything was optimized to draw the player's identification with Joel's growing sense of raw emotional rediscovery. And the key to everything came from the tight dictatorial control over the player's experience, because it meant everything was felt and not spoken. Therefore, as a piece of media, it sharply exists in between mediums, until the ending that is, which galvanizes all this participatory empathy to overpower the purposes of the game's story itself. Joel becomes the villain for the story, but is unconditionally the protagonist of the experience. And through that contradiction, the story was able to have a very powerful message about life, despite the broader context of death.
No matter what, you keep finding something to fight for.
In contrast, Last of Us Part 2 isn't about life, it's about death. It doesn't explore the drama of human development, but dwells on how trauma prohibits change. And it does so by further exploiting this style of bending everything around empathy. Like with Joel's mission to save Ellie from the Fireflies, Ellie's mission of revenge for Joel is designed to draw a wedge between the player and the character so that friction of emotions can be harvested. On a moment-to-moment mechanical level, violence is deliberately staged to be upsetting. The gore is not as artificial looking. Random enemies have specific names. When you grab someone, real detail is put into giving them unique sympathetic reactions.
Drop him! Now! anything stupid.
And you also have to shoot dogs now out of necessity. Unlike other video games, Last of Us Part 2 doesn't embrace the artifice of its violence, but acknowledges it with sympathy, so it becomes a means of sustaining the overall dramatic themes. The player wants revenge, but killing is a guilty exercise. There's an emotional logic behind the mechanical limitations that deepens the context of both. While on a narrative level, the story provides the infrastructure for this system of emotions by deliberately killing Joel prematurely. There's no dishonest cinematic filter like having Joel redeem himself by staying behind in a showdown to save Ellie, or driving a truck full of explosives into a horde of infected.
Please get up!
Because if it did any of those dramatically tired moments, then it wouldn't provoke the same visceral, motivating hatred in the player. Joel's death is designed to break the wall between Ellie and the player. And this is an immensely high-risk, high-reward storytelling decision, because if the player resists or outright refuses to involve and contextualize their anger into the staging of the story, then the whole house of cards collapses before it's even built. But if the player fits into this bond, then they're immediately immersed into a deeply heavy collection of sophisticated emotions. Both the player and Ellie participates in dehumanizing the other. And the game doesn't judge you for it, and therefore, only you can judge yourself. This delicate balance of emotional empathy and distance is at its most explicit when Ellie kills Nora.
I'm not giving up, my friend.
The story cannot continue unless you hit that prompt button, and in the same way Ellie doesn't want to do it but willfully blinds herself with rage to justify this action, the player needs to willfully immerse in the same ignorance. So every hit becomes a commitment towards the performance of Ellie. Like with Joel, the empathy more so than the combat becomes the real substance of the experience. Except instead of becoming a host for the feeling of unconditional love, the player is a host of unprocessed hatred. The game tightens its focus on this theming when it switches perspectives. The story of Joel's killer Abby encompasses more or less the entire second act, and is deliberately structured this way to galvanize the careful wedge between the player and Ellie.
We let you both live. And you wasted it!
All the false moral confidence that the player and Ellie had been implicitly building is torn down by an expansion of the game's directed empathy. On one hand, this switch makes for an extremely exhausting experience because all of a sudden you have to reset both your attention and patience, as new motivations, new conflicts, and new relationships have to be learned. Similar to Joel's death, this is also an insanely big high-risk and high-reward storytelling decision where its success rate is based purely on the player's level of resistance. Is anyone willing to be empathetic and step out of the limits of their own subjective worldview? Ironically, Abby's story is centered on this same question. After avenging her father by killing Joel, she then begins to form a connection with her people's enemy through Lev and Yara.
He's not one of them, please.
Abby, move.
God damn it, he's just a kid!
There's three purposes to Abby's story. First, it's rhythmically structured to lift the game's feeling up. There are now attractive themes of rebirth and hope, so immediately your motives are often more altruistic. Like getting medical supplies to help Yara or going to save Lev from the island. These moments of life and adventure were deliberately omitted from Ellie's story, so the game never brute forces you to empathize with Abby. Instead, the empathy comes from the naturalism of the staging. Secondly, Ellie is no longer the center of the universe, and her feelings don't shape the logic of the story like Joel did. Instead, her presence and the player's confidence is disempowered, which is the big emotional payoff for all of the thematic groundwork that the moment-to-moment violence had been invisibly laying. And finally, Abby's story creates a mechanical intertextual connection with Joel's story. The ladders and puzzles that involved making paths from the first Last of Us often gets made fun of, but it was also key to the game's naturalistic pacing. Joel moves forward through Ellie, and Ellie moves forward with Joel, and through their reliance on each other mechanically, Joel feels more intimately connected with Ellie, and the player feels closer to Joel. Abby's story heavily relies on this very specific rhythm. She learns to look after Lev in order to progress the stage, and in doing so, begins to pay attention to what she's becoming.
Abby!
Therefore, ironically, playing as Abby feels more like Joel than Ellie does, even though her story is all about him. And this contradiction then contributes back to Ellie's story because it spotlights that her obsession to be more like him is a futile illusion, and that her mission to kill Abby means also killing someone else's Joel.
He's not a part of this. You made him a part of this.
In the same way the first Last of Us expressed the limits of love by showing how it bounced between Joel and Ellie, now the limits of hate is bounced between Ellie and Abby.
Don't ever let me see you again.
Both Ellie and Abby's story is an exploration of trauma, and yes, I get to talk about trauma again, finally. Imagination, memory, and trauma always exists in a triangle of interplay within our identities, because our sense of self are more or less narratives that is built on our relationships with the past. For both Ellie and Abby, this comes in the form of living under the unconditional love of a father figure, but trauma is when that relationship with that narrative is broken. Because it's when an event is so painful that the stability of that continuity is destroyed, and new experiences can no longer be assimilated. This is why both of their relationships with their lovers in the form of Dina and Owen break down.
No.
When you can't look back and make meaning from the past, because if all you can feel is a non-communicable sense of pain and confusion, then it makes it impossible to imagine a future, or even convince that there is one.
I don't sleep. I don't eat. I'm not like you, Dina.
Trauma orientates life backwards. It's a pit where time itself collapses in your mind. And clinically speaking, reinvention is often the key for treating it. And this is where Abby comes in. Her story operates on the other end of this process because she killed Joel at the beginning, but it never filled that emptiness.
Sorry I grew up. You should try it.
Oh yeah, how do I do that? Should I go find the people that killed my family? Cut into them? I could torture them until they're crying, you know?
But what allows her to move forward is the decision to build a new identity where she's no longer a daughter without a father, but now a mother to this boy. Lev and the dream to find the Fireflies again, like Owen, is the new logic that allows her to envision a future again. Ellie's life lacks this logic despite being provided a new identity as a mother too, because her happy life at the farm with Dina, also looking after Jesse's baby, were very much given to her. It wasn't an identity she built herself, so that lack of authorship makes it all unconvincing and fragile, to the extent that it can be broken down just by a few words from her own past.
I'll make her pay.
Tommy.
That's what you said when we got back to Jackson.
Tommy.
The third act is the shortest, and it directs this theme to the player. Ellie leaves home to hunt down Abby, while Abby and Lev are captured by the Rattlers, who regularly prey on travelers to torture and kill. Therefore, to reach Abby, you have to fight your way through them.
She's in a holding cell in our camp.
So for the first time in so many hours, the game actually lays supportive foundations for you to feel morally confident in your acts of violence, but also to feel wholly energized by this feeling. You have to also sense that this is very clearly a rescue mission, not an assassination. Accepting this pays off the journey spent with Abby by recognizing that she and Lev are worth saving, so when Ellie forces the final showdown to happen, it feels unnaturally obliged, especially when there's no glamour or cinematic gratification to it. You're just senselessly beating this woman down as she's trying to protect a child. This climax is also the game at its most naked. Joel killed Abby's father, so Abby killed Joel, and now Ellie is about to kill Abby, which would unquestionably lead Lev to eventually go after Ellie, and eventually JJ is going to grow up in this cycle and it will all carry on. In the end, after Ellie loses 2 of her fingers, murdered a whole small army, and has Abby drowning before her very hands, she ends up backing off from a simple flash of Joel from the past. This isn't what Joel wanted for Ellie. In his mind, he saved her to break the cycle of man's unrelenting evil and taking away children, and now Ellie is losing the very sympathy that gave her life.
Just take him.
Within this moment of forgiveness, she finally assembles a new continuity where her memories of Joel doesn't demand violence but love. And the very final note is bittersweet. Dina and the baby has left her, the farm is abandoned, all that is left are Ellie's possessions in a corner, including the guitar Joel gave her. Ellie, with her missing fingers, can't even play it anymore. But it's okay because she remembers on the night before his death, they reconciled, and the conclusiveness of that memory permits her the right to imagine the future again.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
I'd like that.
So she's okay with putting the guitar down and close the book of her old identity. We don't know where Ellie goes, but she has all she needs, the right memories, to author her life. All felt and not said for the player. The game could have and probably should have started with Abby because it would have made digesting her point of view easier, but by putting her right in the middle, the act of forgiveness starts with the player and not Ellie. Therefore, it deepens the way it communicates the psychology of trauma. The story of The Last of Us Part 2 isn't exactly new, but it's able to lean heavier on the abstract side of this sort of revenge story by taking full advantage of the gaming medium, where the substance isn't from what's on screen but what's between it and the player. Similar to reading a novel, the player doesn't get the full experience unless they put empathy into it. And for that reason, as a guy who likes video games because it's such a deeply interesting intersection of culture and technology, this game represents an epoch of sorts. This is a AAA game that refuses to submit to consumer want in terms of continuing to commodify Joel, but instead is so committed to its own sense of artistic integrity and creative opinion that it's willing to take a gamble. It puts all of its egg in one basket, in one singular unique aspect of video game empathy. Therefore, regardless of its foolishness or bravery, I'm immensely fascinated by this new breed of games where millions of dollars aren't spent to entertain but to communicate what has always been clinically difficult to express.